prices. There's no alternative for Europe to Russian gas in the short term. There are options for developing alternatives, U.S. Liquefied natural gas from Qatar, potentially, gas from Azerbaijan or Israel if Israel develops its offshore resources. But in the immediate term, there is no real alternative to Russian gas. So that's going to be a pretty steep price for the Europeans, for the European people to pay.
I like how they can't really sanction oligarchs, especially oligarchs living in other countries, that much, because it's like, well, goodbye, City of London.
Exactly.
Like if we can't, if these banks can't launder money,
Right,
then like what
right,
can they do?
exactly. Yeah, there's vulnerability both ways, right? Like you can sanction the oligarchs, but you're gonna be
Hey, what
cutting off
you
your
want the
own
Louis
noses.
Vuitton store to close down? Think of all the jobs. Think of all the jobs that'll cost. All right, so like I know last week everyone thought like World War III was going to happen any moment now. I mean, there's a lot of people who are still saying that, but I mean, it seems like the likelihood of, if not like a full scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, but some military intervention or some sort of armed conflict seems to be more likely than not. Would you agree with that?
I think that what's happened over the last 24 hours, let's say, has increased the likelihood of a larger military conflict than the one that already existed, kind of, was frozen in eastern Ukraine. I think it may have, and this, very much depends on what happens next, but it may have reduced a bit the likelihood of this like nightmare scenario that the Biden administration has been talking about with a full scale invasion and like sieges of all the cities and kill lists and mass executions and all these kind of wild scenarios that they've been running with. The Russians, in recognizing the DNR and the LNR, their independence, there was briefly some ambiguity about what that meant in terms of, did they just mean the territory that those republics control right now, or did they mean the entirety of Donetsk and Luhansk provinces in Ukraine, most of which are actually still kind of on the government side of the front line? Um, the Russian Foreign Ministry issued a statement earlier, very early today, that I think suggested they might just be talking about the republics as they exist now, which could have maybe forestalled a bigger conflict. But then Putin made a statement that I think was pretty unambiguous, that what he recognized was the independence of all of Donetsk and Luhansk as the DNR and LNR kind of claim them, which is, to say all of both of those provinces. They claim the entirety of those provinces. That I think, if that's the way they're going to approach this, it probably makes some level of a conflict inevitable. But I think probably on a level that would be more akin to, let's say, the 2008 Russian war in Georgia, or even if you want to go back a little further, the Kosovo war in the late 90s. So not a regime change, like not an Iraq 2003 full scale invasion and regime change operation, but something meant to establish kind of the separation, the independence and the separation of these republics on the territory that they define as theirs.
Assuming for the moment that all parties here would prefer no violence to occur rather than any level of armed conflict. In your opinion, are there serious diplomatic avenues or alternatives that are not being pursued here by, like, for instance, by the State Department, or like, I mean, like, is there any way to like to turn down the temperature before any true like outbreak of hostilities or armed conflict
It,
happens?
it may be too late at this point. I mean, I think that there was a window to do something like, the term that people use is Finlandization. This is, refers back to Finland kind of declaring neutrality in the early 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century, and forestalling a Russian or Soviet at that point invasion. Ukraine could have done something like that. It could have forsworn the possibility of ever joining NATO in return for some kind of a guarantee from Russia. Who knows whether that would have actually worked, but it was one possible path to take. I think that's probably foreclosed by now. I don't think you can resurrect that. So I'm a little pessimistic now about what diplomatic initiatives could stop this, especially if the LNR and the DNR are intent on seizing more territory from the government. I think that's probably um, guaranteeing a conflict. But it's possible that the Ukrainian military could fall back to a deeper line. You could sort of test out whether the Russians are going to be satisfied to just establish the independence of these republics or their occupation of them, and or whether they have designs on going further. One of the things I'd be worried about, frankly, as we just talked about this kind of wave of new sanctions with more to come, is doing too much. If you respond, a lot of the planning that's gone into how are we going to sanction Russia? What are we going to do? And sort of these discussions that have been happening between the U.S. and other NATO members and European Union members has been attuned to the idea of this full scale invasion. And so you've got these very maximal sanctions that would do maximum damage to the Russian economy. If you impose that level of sanction now after something that falls short of a full scale invasion, you put Russia, you put Putin in particular, in the position of saying, like, what do I have to lose then? If you're just going to do this to me anyway, there's no deterrent anymore. I might as well just go all the way to Kiev and beyond. So that's one of the things I would worry about is over sanctioning in response to what's happened thus far and kind of trying to calibrate those things. Yeah, I'm pessimistic about any diplomatic channel that could actually just completely avoid conflict at this point.
I want to get your take on one of the things I read today from a former Obama advisor and Harvard economist who said that in terms of the global economy,
Wow, you're starting off on a great foot.
he said they said that in terms of the global economy, Russia is totally insignificant except for oil and gas, and it's essentially a gas station. And I was just wondering, like, I mean, what does that mean? Because it would seem like, aside from oil and gas, yeah, it seems they're pretty insignificant. But
Yeah, other
with
than that,
oil
it's
and
just like
gas,
how it's a play.
are they totally
Yeah,
insignificant? I don't know.
I mean,
Like, is
Russia
Russia just a gas station? I understand, like, their GDP is like not even the size of Spain's or whatever, but like they do have a shitload of
yes.
oil and gas.
This is a thing that Obama people, ex-Obama people, really like to talk about this, and they like to belittle Russia in this particular way. And it's not entirely wrong. I mean, Russia is a kind of strange dichotomy of a country that has a great powers military and a very middling powers economy. But they are, instrumental to the global oil market. I mean, they're one of two countries, along with Saudi Arabia, that can basically dictate what the price of oil is going to be at any given time. They control, or they share control of OPEC Plus, which is the big oil cartel conglomerate that determines supply. So they have a tremendous amount of influence in that regard. They have a huge amount of influence. We just talked about their gas supply, which Europe is essentially beholden to, and it's going to be a very rocky time if Russia. I mean, if in response to, let's say, shutting down Nord Stream 2, if the Russians decide to cut off all gas supplies to Europe, that's a real threat, and that could really do some damage to Europe. So they're obviously important. I mean, they have some obvious ways that some obvious levers that they can pull to do real economic harm to the rest of the world. So yeah, I don't know what sense it makes to kind of belittle them in that fashion, even if you can acknowledge that they're not an economic powerhouse. They're not China. They're not kind of at playing at that level, but still pretty important.
If I could, like, I mean, just like to switch gears from Ukraine for a second, but like they are related in this sense. Like, like Afghanistan, like the American withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Biden administration's, seemingly belated, but eventually necessary confrontation with reality that they were willing to take that L. I remember when that happened, we all had this idea that it was like, great, finally, we're ending a war. But it was this kind of like, ugh, like a little bit queasy because like the U.S. empire doesn't pull out of somewhere without ramping up elsewhere. Like, how do you see like America's role in this in terms of like reasserting itself after being embarrassed by the fall of Kabul.
I mean, I think there's something to that. There is a one of the underlying issues here from the Russian perspective, and I think there's a tendency to discard this because I guess anything Putin says, we have to pretend that he's lying because otherwise we're apologizing for him or whatever. But one of the things he's repeatedly talked about is the threat of a NATO. Of Ukraine becoming a NATO member and stationing, the possibility of stationing U.S. weapons or NATO weaponry and personnel in Ukraine, and how close that would put them to Moscow, and what a security risk that would be. I do think, and I don't know that you can necessarily tie it directly to Afghanistan and sort of reasserting, but there is this sort of insistence, and there has been this insistence that NATO membership is like this sacrosanct right of all nations, and we can't possibly compromise in this area. And on the one hand, like realistically, okay, I can sort of understand that, or I can sort of when this situation was really blowing up and Putin was issuing his list of demands, like I want to be able to dictate where NATO expands, or if NATO expands at all, and where NATO positions its soldiers. I mean, this isn't something that NATO as an organization could accept. But at the same time, like if you just stop trying to kind of muscle your way further east and push this alliance closer and closer to Russia's borders, I think maybe you could have avoided all of this. And again, I don't know that you can tie it necessarily to kind of we're trying to swing our dicks around after Afghanistan, but it's certainly a part of this imperial swagger and this need to be everywhere at all times, and throw America's weight around all over the world.
Do you think that because I feel like in Biden world, kind of, you have guys that are like, sort of clear eyed on things like Libya and maybe Syria, but then his concession there is that he has, people who are the opposite of that on Ukraine. And it seemed like the people that he was always going to get, like on his Security Council, like for state and everything like that, they were going to want to take like a way more aggressive posture. I mean, I think it was kind of written that it was going to be this way, because this is also like that's also like a central mantelpiece of the enforced liberal world order, like a strong Ukraine where you're implying that there is an on ramp for them to join NATO.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine in particular plays into this idea of spreading the liberal world order all over the place, and NATO expansion to not just Ukraine, to Georgia, to who knows where else is a big part of that. Is sort of this idea that we can NATO, which lost its reason for being in 1990, basically, that it's become this thing where we kind of spread the great liberal world order, and kind of bring more and more parts of the world underneath its um I don't know, protective embrace or something. I don't know.
I was going to ask though, like, this what we're seeing right now, this can't be like what the Hawks pictured. Like, I know that they don't, like, you can't full on call it a failure because they don't exactly want like peaceful coexistence. But it's hard looking at this and trying to figure out what they wanted. Like if you're a more hawkish Atlantic Council member or something like that.
I mean, cynically, I got the sense that a lot of them wanted the invasion. Like a lot of them wanted the full scale Russian invasion, so that we could do the heaviest possible sanctions, so that we could take as big a bite out of the Russian economy. And Ukraine would have been lost. A lot of people would die. Could still, I mean, this could all still happen. I'm not saying that we've completely, kind of we're completely out of the woods in that possibility. A lot of Ukrainians would die, a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, but that would be Ukrainians. I mean, it's basically like we're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian life to punish Russia, or to take a bite out of Russia. And I also think you have to uh, 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 accommodate, or consider what the last, well, I guess 6 years at this point have done to the democratic brain in terms of Russia, and the 2016 election, and Trump and his relationship with Putin. and just the obsession with that, what that's done in terms of the whole party, but certainly the kind of people that Biden brought in around him for foreign policy in terms of just their conception of the threat, I guess, that Russia poses, or the need to do something about this Putin character. I think it's embedded there. It's taken hold pretty strongly. Not just in the party, kind of politically, but in the media ecosystem around it as well.
As long as we're talking about punishing people, I just want to like take a quick digression, and I was wondering, Derek, if you could explain to me or to us and our listeners